Hey MMT followers, Christina Fugis with MoldMaking Technology here for a special MMT chat, a little sneak peek into one of my editorial advisory board member board meetings done virtually, and a special guest speaker giving a little update on the state of the industry, Michael Guckes from Gardner Intelligence. Take a listen. This is Michael Guckes, who just popped up. So Gardner Intelligence is basically an arm of Gardner Business Media. So he does the monthly mold making index. So I thought you guys mentioned about having an interest in data. So Michael prepared some data. So let's go through and give a little, I guess, what's the latest that you're hearing and what are you tracking?
Okay, so here we go, guys. So, as Christina knows, she and I got really excited back in the August-September period where we saw the mold making index right up around 55. It has unfortunately fallen quite a bit in the last 2 months. And all that really means is that in October, we saw, what the heck? That wasn't me. Hang on a second. I think it's trying to play the presentation for me. Sorry about that. So what we've seen here is slowing expansion. That's what we saw in October. We had a reading, I think, around 53.4. This month we saw, and this was not specific to mold making. This really was the same across all of the manufacturing disciplines that we track. But we saw a big fall in new orders production. Export activity has been down, all year long. It got a little worse. Employment was down, backlogs were down. So we ended up at 47.9. If you work that number backwards, across history, you can see that usually puts us somewhere near the bottom to middle bottom of some of our past business cycles. Not a great place to be. Certainly it could be worse, as we all know from the beginning of this year. But I think that, what we're seeing is a lot of the challenges that, Mark pointed out. Our supplier deliveries reading added 2.2 points to the index. If you were to strip the troubles with the supplier deliveries situation out of the reading and just looked at an index that's a combination of the other 5 components, right? Production, new orders, backlog, employment, exports, you end up at 45.7, which is that's a much more challenging number. Again, it has everything, I think, to do with what we're seeing right now. We have this kind of perfect storm. You've got strong seasonal shipping right now. Everyone's doing everything by e-commerce. We have to worry about COVID vaccine distribution, and on top of that, of course, the airlines. The passenger airlines, that is, they make up a huge part of the air cargo capacity, in the holds of those jets. Those guys aren't flying. I don't know if you guys saw the news. Delta, surprisingly, had to cancel what would have been revenue-generating, probably profitable flights over Thanksgiving because they were understaffed in their pilots. They'd cut back more pilots than they should have. And so they ended up having to cancel flights that would have otherwise, been quite profitable. I mean, that's just the kind of year it has been. Everyone seems to be struggling to figure out what to do. I think Mark put it perfectly. When there's no plan in place, there's no capacity. That's I think pretty much spot on. You can see here, this is a 3-month moving average. This just helps to slow down the numbers. So the last bit of the line you're seeing here, that is the average of the November, October, and September readings. So you can see how it's already turning down. It's quite a bit worse if you look at the month to months, but this is just to give you guys a sense of the trend. Again, my computer is jumping ahead of me. How do I stop this thing? Anyways.
It's out of control.
It is out of control. That's all right. I'm a dad with young children. I'm used to this. Hang on a second. Let me see if I can pause this again. So that's what we're seeing on the new orders and production side. I was really hopeful that we were going to see some continuation in the expansionary trend that we saw in that third quarter. Seems like that's probably not going to happen. Here's a little bit of I think what Mark focus on, and what I want to focus on as well is it's the reading. It's really a comparison of production activity in orange and then our supplier deliveries reading in green. If you guys read any of the articles I've put out recently regarding the GBI, you'll know that supplier deliveries, this reading is, another way to think of it is the orders to fulfillment time length. The longer it takes orders to be fulfilled, the higher the supplier deliveries reading goes. And the reason why we do that is because in a normal business cycle environment, like if you think back to 2017, 2018, when we had a really great upswing, people were ordering lots and lots of different products from their upstream suppliers. Those guys had lengthening backlogs, and those upstream lengthening backlogs lead to longer order to fulfillment periods. And what we want to do is we want to capture that strength, that pull on the upstream suppliers as a good thing. And so that's why order to fulfillment time periods, when they lengthen, we consider that in a normal world a good thing. And that's obviously everything is now upside down in 2020, but this sort of trifecta of seasonal demand, COVID distribution, and then just the normal disruption from COVID has really lengthened those orders to fulfillment periods here in the fourth quarter. So as that goes up, it's going to cap the ability of all you guys, as I'm sure you're experiencing. It's going to make your jobs to get the right materials in place and to keep appropriate inventories. It's going to make that job a lot harder, and that's going to put a cap on probably how quickly you can adjust your production. If it would be interesting to see, had new orders remained a lot stronger in November, and production were to continue to try to meet the new orders growth, it would be interesting to know, at what point do these lengthening supplier delivery times start to cap production's ability to keep up? That's something I can't see here, and certainly all of you guys personally know what that would look like for each of you. It's just something that it's got me thinking. Here is another part to that whole supplier deliveries component, is how are your input costs moving as supplier deliveries are essentially in a worsening state here in the fourth quarter. Interestingly enough, if you think of these as one having a causal effect on the other, typically, going back to 2017, 2018, we saw that as supply chains felt the pull of downstream demand, material prices increased. That makes a lot of sense as your upstream suppliers have essentially more bargaining power, right? They have the ability to reflect that in their prices. And so we definitely saw that in 2018, and then it sort of slowed down as we moved into 2019. My concern here is, looking at these latest months of numbers, right? You've got a lot of disruption that is probably going to continue on that supplier delivery side, and the materials prices is already being reflected in that. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the upstream suppliers know that they simply have overwhelming orders for all this stuff, and that's that's being reflected early here in the material prices, which means that you're going to see additional supplier deliveries readings move higher here, coming into the close of 2020 and then into 2021. Again, that trifecta of pull on the logistics space is going to be a challenge here. I think that's going to be something that a lot of manufacturers are going to have to, take account of here and adjust business accordingly. By size, and this is just, again, looking at the mold making and the molding space, we've seen that smaller firms are taking it on the chin quite a bit more than the larger firms. There may be a couple of reasons for this. The larger firms may have a better distribution, not distribution strategy, but diversification. That's the D word I'm looking for. Diversification plan, where they're working with multiple end markets. Sometimes the smaller firms that we know well are usually in maybe a single end market, and therefore their fate is essentially tied to a single end market, which, right now it's very much hit or miss, right? The larger firms also may have more negotiating power with either their suppliers or their customers. And so we've seen a little bit better outcomes for the larger firms as compared to the smaller firms. When it comes to cap spending, which, in this case here may include, those molds, we've seen that the larger firms have been on an encouraging trend upward here in the last several months. We see them, essentially coming back to roughly where they were at the end of 2019 in terms of their expected spending on CapEx goods over the next 12 months. The one thing that you can see here is the volatility, right? We're seeing a lot of little ripples in 2020 on that orange line representing the largest firms. You don't necessarily see the same kind of real small volatility month to month in the history of that. But more importantly, look at everyone else, right? Oops, sorry, even the 100 to 250 person firms, right? We're seeing essentially an extension of a long-term downward trend there. I looked a little bit more into those numbers. I think what happens is that either those firms grow or shrink. The 100 to 250 employee firms, it's a pool that has some turnover. Either they get bigger or they get smaller, but they don't stay necessarily in that range forever. So there's that trend. But furthermore, just to close this one off, the very smallest guys, I'm maybe a little surprised that they haven't sort of pulled on the purse strings a little tighter here. For the most part, they're just kind of humming along. They're buying the CapEx goods that they need to just to maintain functionality. Maybe they don't have a growth plan in place, but they have a maintenance plan in place, and that's why we're seeing so little volatility at those smaller sizes. Again, thinking back to where are we in terms of profitability, I like to show this chart to our clients because it gives you a sense of both your pricing power on the prices received line in orange here, but also what's happening to your cost of production, right? And this one, of course, is just a proxy for your materials prices, not your labor. But what we did see during the middle of 2020 was essentially some profit compression. We see that whenever the orange line is below 50, but the blue line is above, because what that is telling us is that a majority, even if it's only a modest majority of firms here, we're seeing either no change in their pricing power, or they were seeing a slight decline in their pricing power, while at the same time, a growing proportion of mold makers and molders were seeing their material prices increase. So that has to come out as a pressure on profit margins. By end market served, right? So this is why Steve Klein and I are always talking about having a game plan for a firm that is not a single end market, but is a diversification strategy. Even if you have only 2, maybe 3 end markets that you're serving, having that diversification can be huge in order for you to maintain minimally efficient and economical production levels. But you can see here, medical, of course, has done really well here in the last 6 months or so. Custom processors come in second, automotive, electronics. The automotive picture is really interesting to us because, if you think back to 2008, one of the great challenges on the automotive side was that you had too much production, right? We were doing, cash for clunkers. We were doing, everything possible to get new cars off the lots. This year is completely different, right? If you go back to the first quarter of the year, there was no demand for cars, but there was also no production for cars. And if you look at the absolute numbers, right, I think there were 1,700 cars produced in either March or April. And I think all of those came from one Tesla factory in California because, Elon told the governor to go pound salt. He was going to make cars even though he was told not to. And that was the only reason why we had, 1,700 cars produced in the country. And so, you had this really amazing thing where the numbers went to nothing and then they came right back. And there was this crazy snapback in the second quarter. Right now, Toyota Tundra trucks, I think there's something like an 8 to 11 day inventory of those kinds of trucks. Other pickup trucks, the F-150, the Silverado, they're below average in terms of their inventory on hand. So you're seeing a really strange situation in automotive that has worked out kind of nicely. The other thing too is big ticket items. The luxury cars, the large SUVs, RVs, boats, those markets continue to be abnormally strong considering that we're in the middle of a recession. If you look at all those markets back in '08, they were crushed. And we're not seeing any of that. We're seeing RV lots that are empty. We're seeing marinas that have great sales levels. And again, the automotive picture on the high-end side is doing surprisingly well. The classic manufacturing end markets, the metal cutting job shops and the machinery and equipment markets, they've been the laggards this year. And I don't know when that's going to turn around, but it's been so interesting to see how this pandemic recession, and that's exactly what we call it, is a pandemic recession, is so different from more classic recessions and classical recession thinking. And so as business leaders, you need to maybe have a little bit of a mind shift here and just remind yourself in the back of your mind that this is not a normal recession. It doesn't use a normal recession playbook. So that was what I wanted to say about that. I think
I thought you had some. I thought you had some more.
Well, maybe I do.
Oh.
So I've got a couple of end markets and a few other little tidbits we can talk about. One of the things here, again, this is a great example of how government activity has in a lot of ways done the right things this year. Ignoring the fact that we have another $2.5 to $3 trillion of long-term debt our children will have to pay. The fact is that the government moved incredibly fast this year to make sure that financial markets stayed more or less stable. The financial sector needed to know that there was going to be a backstop. The Feds provided that within a 3-month period. They provided $660 billion of C&I loans in the course of 3 months. If you look at the total amount of financial backing here that they provided, right, what the Fed managed to do in a period of 2 to 3 months was a multitude greater than what it did in a 12-month period back in 2008. So, this is the work that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury did this year is completely unprecedented. But I think it really saved, it saved the stock market, it saved asset prices, right? And so that was huge, basically making sure that firms and financial institutions had money meant that, we have all these assets that are in incredibly good shape, right? Whether it's homes, stock markets, whatever else you want to look at. Having a strong financial sector has been huge for asset prices, which of course feeds right into consumer sentiment. And without consumer sentiment, we would be in a far worse state than we are now. Fourth quarter GDP projections, right? So these are coming out of the Atlanta Federal Reserve. This is a combination of their forecast from a whole bunch of different equities firms, but that blue chip consensus is looking for GDP growth in the fourth quarter around 3.5%. So that's really good. I think that's fantastic considering all that we've been through this year. And then of course you've got a lot of that relying on a vaccine. And so I put down here, this is from, I believe I pulled this from the Wall Street Journal about maybe almost a month ago, not quite, but you can see the various firms. This is 5 of the 10 firms that are leading, the way with their COVID vaccines. This is going to be huge for, I think, a lot of firms, manufacturers out there, right, as we deal with building a global supply chain and distribution network for either ultra cold vaccines or even just the normal refrigerated vaccines, which I think are coming out by AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. But these new ones, the mRNA vaccines, which is what Pfizer and Moderna built or designed, right? These need those negative 90 degree Fahrenheit, I think it's negative 70 C, something like that. Freezers, those ultra cold freezers as they're called. And that's gonna be a real challenge because, rural hospitals and essentially anything other than a research university type laboratory is just not gonna have that ultra cold infrastructure in place. So there's gonna be a lot of potential for manufacturing to figure out, how do you fit into this? And I wouldn't keep it to just the US, of course, but think about how do you distribute this in, Africa a lot of, East Asia. The less developed the supply chain is there for medical equipment, devices, whatnot, the more they're going to have to grow, right? So how do we turn those things into opportunities for, molders, mold makers, et cetera? This is really interesting. I put this out on the Gardner Intelligence website, I think earlier this week, but the Commerce Department essentially gave Bedford Industries, which makes twist ties, right? Nothing that is intellectually protected. These things go back 70 years in their current form. But there was a ruling in Bedford's favor against Chinese imports of twist ties. And the ruling was, I think it showed a foundational shift in how this country is going to look at applying tariffs and levies in the future, because all they said was, look, we have evidence here that China is manipulating their currency. Therefore, the price of Chinese twist ties has to be mispriced. It has to be too low, and therefore we're going to award you a financial reward for that, or relief. And that's huge, because if that's the barrier now for companies to receive relief from Chinese imports, that could be a game changer, especially in the mold making and mold building space, right, Christina, where there can be a lot of competition there. If this opens the door so that any mold maker can essentially argue for a tariff or some kind of financial relief because of Chinese imports, simply because China has at a macro level manipulated their currency, which is easy to prove, and which the current administration in the White House has been very aware of and very vocal about, right? This could be huge for manufacturing. Last, I've got a couple slides here just on the medical industry. I think this is interesting because if you look at the 20-year growth of personal consumption expenditures, so that's just consumer spending on health care and hospitalization services and goods, right? This would be a 5.3% compounded annual growth chart, right? So if you just draw that orange line from 2000 to 2020, that would be a 5.3% growth. But from 2012 to present, it's actually at 8%. And so your question should be, well, why am I choosing 2012 as my year to start, this shortened CAGR line here? And the reason being is that's the first year that baby boomers started turning 65 and being able to, apply for different types of, government-sponsored aid. And ever since, as more boomers enter into these programs, right, we've seen a definite change in the long-term growth of the medical spending market. So this is going to be an interesting change because this doesn't go away, right? This is a demographic change which economists love because it's easy to know when somebody is going to turn 65 or approximately when they turn any other age. It's easy to do it because it's just simple math. And then here, this is from our equities analyst data. So we get all this data on all the different firms that are in the medical market, and we're looking at either medical devices or medical instruments. Here, I believe the instruments is blue, the devices is the orange line here, and you can see that essentially you get essentially a quick fall here in 2020, but as soon as you get into the first quarter of 2021, second quarter of 2021, these guys are right back to where they were, growing at somewhere between 5 and 15%, which is pretty much where they've always been. It's one of the fastest growing end markets that I think really applies to manufacturing. So, and then of course, the question becomes one of, do these numbers go even higher simply because of the COVID distribution strategies that have yet to be designed and the whole rollout of a global supply chain for all of these vaccines? So I think there's a lot of upside to here as well. So I think that is truly it there.
Thank you everyone for listening, and for everything mold making, visit moldmakingtechnology.com.